Hey everyone, Serge LeBlanc here. In this video, we're going to go over a problem on how to answer a question using SQL from the data set that we used in the previous two classes, the Iowa liquor store sales. And hopefully in this example, we're going to go over a number of concepts that will help you clarify and give you more context to what we learned in class. So looking at this question here, what is the total number of sales transactions for vendors 305, 370, and 420? So the question is asking here is how many sales transactions do I have for a specific list of vendors? So let's go ahead and take a look at where this information might be found. If we go to our database explorer, we see that there's a sales table, and it looks like it has a list of transaction, has a date on it, and then for which vendor, for which item. So this looks like a transactional table where every time a sale is made, it would be recorded in this table. All right. So let's go ahead and go back here. And whenever I have before I answer any kind of questions, the first thing I normally do is just do a select star on the table just to get a feel for what the data looks like. So I always like to do a select star with the limit of 10 normally. Okay. So here we have the date, store number, and different vendors and the list of items that were sold from this one transaction. Okay. So what the question is asking is the total number of sales transactions. So number of sales transactions. So that sounds like what we need to do here is just count the number of rows in the table, because every row is one transaction, right? This question is asking what is the number of transactions for these specific vendors. So it sounds like we're going to have to do a select count, right? So select count something. Okay, now what are we counting? Well, because every row in the database is in this table, because every row in this table is a transaction, we're just counting rows. So if all we need to do is count rows, we can use count star. It's a very common way of just counting rows, but really you can put anything in there. You could put count one, count whatever. It'll do the same thing. But we'll go with count star. It's very common. So select count star. That will be counting the number of rows. Now, after we do our select statement, we tell it which table should I be counting from. So in this case, it's sales, right? And now there's a condition to this question. It's like count the total number of transactions, okay? But only for vendors 305, 370, and 420. So one thing that we learned last week that could be useful here is the in clause. In gives us the ability to provide a list for our query. So let's go ahead and try that. So count star from sales, where vendor, so how do we reference the vendor? It looks like it's called vendor number, right? So vendor number in, and then we provide a list. So let's just go ahead, 305, 370, 420. All right, so we're counting rows from sales for these vendors. So this should work, right? So let's go ahead and try this. Oh, what do we have here? Operator does not exist. Text equals integer. So it looks like what it's giving us a problem on is you might need to add explicit casts. So let's go take a look what might be happening here. So looking at our database explorer, we go to the vendor number. Oh, and sure enough, a vendor number is a text field, right? And if we look at our query, we're actually providing it integers. So we have two options here. One is because vendor number is a text, we need to provide it a list of text items to go through. So if we add quotes around each number, it will treat these numbers as text. Okay, so if we hit control return now, this should work. Okay, beautiful, and it did. So it looks like it has 265,309 rows, so transactions for these vendors. Now, instead of casting each individual item in this list here as a text, we can do the opposite. We can go ahead and cast vendor number as an integer. So let's do that instead and see if we get the same result. Oops. Okay, so remember how we learned how to cast? We go cast open parentheses, vendor number as int, close parentheses. So now this is an integer, and we're looking for integers in this list. Let's see if this worked. Perfect, boom, we saw same number. So we see our previous result and this result, we get the same number. So that's good. Now, we know that we can use in to provide a list, but the equivalent of in is really replacing the or clause in this case. So another way to write this will show you the value of the in clause. Another way would be or, let me just go ahead and copy this, equals 305 or vendor number 370 or, so you see how I have to keep adding these or clauses. So ideally that's not what we want to do, right? But I just want to show you that is the in clause is the equivalent of all of these or clauses. Oh, and what do we have here? Oh, where, so this is not correct, so just 1 second here. There we go. So where the vendor number is 305 or these. So I was getting ahead of myself there. Let's try this again. And there we go. We have the same result. So this shows you that the in and the or, they can be equivalent, but it's often a lot better to use the in clause instead of writing all these extra or clauses. All right. Now let's go back to our in clause. I want to show you another thing that we can do. 305, 70, 420. Okay. So we learned last class that another way to cast is by using the double colons. So here in order to cast the vendor number as an integer, we had cast here, but another way to do it is to remove cast, just add 2 colons int, and let's see what happens. And we get the same result. So the difference between the two is that the two colons here, it won't work for every type, for every data type. So cast is more general, but for most data types, for dates, integers, numeric, this will work. It's a little less typing, and it can be really useful. Okay. Now, finally, let's take a look at this question and let's try and answer it a little bit differently. So the question asks, what is the total number of sales transactions for these vendors? All right, so all I did here was I counted the total for all three. But what if I'm interested in knowing, well, I wonder how each one of them had. Okay, well, let's think about that for a second. So now I want to know how much each of these vendors have transactions. So it looks like we'll have to count rows, and we'll need to group them by the individual vendors. So whenever you encounter something like that, what I do is I start with my select statement, and then I say, okay, what are we going to be grouping by? We're going to be grouping by vendor number. All right, so that's the first thing that we put in our select statement, vendor number. And then what we want to do is count by vendor number. So we add a comma, we line it up here, and we'll do a count star. All right, so what this does, we're selecting the vendor number, and then we're going to count the number of rows for each vendor number. Right? All right, so after our select statement comes our from. It's from the sales table. And then what do we do next here? This is where the group by comes into play. So whenever we're doing any aggregation function, we need to add a group by clause so that the query knows that we're counting by something. So here, you count by, and we learned that we can do 1 to specify the first column, or we can go ahead and spell everything out, vendor number. So let's go ahead and try that and see what works, see if it works. Okay, so now we have for every vendor number, but that's not what I wanted, right? I wanted only these vendor numbers. So all we do here is we add our same where clause following from, right? So select this vendor number, count, group by, from sales, but only where the vendor number is in this list. All right, and sure enough, boom, here we go. We get our results. All right, now let's just test to see, instead of typing out vendor number, I am grouping by the first column, which is number 1. Do we get the same results? Yes, the query worked and we get the same results. Okay. Now, there was also questions about the order by and having. So the order by, you can think of it as a sort. So after you've done your query, if you want to sort your results, you can add another clause that says order by. And let's say that I want to know, I want these lists in ascending order. I want the top one first. So I'll say order by 2. I want to order by the second column. Right? Let's see what happens when I do that. Oh, okay. So we get it sorted, but it's not in the order that I wanted. I wanted the top result on top. So in that case, instead of sorting ascending, I want sort descending. So we just add DSC and then run our query, and it will sort in the reverse order. Okay? Now, finally, let's say that I want to do this counting and grouping and sorting, but I only want results if the counts are greater than 35,000. Otherwise, I'm not interested. So how would we do that? Well, we know that we learned how to add filtering with the where clause and. So how can we do that? We can try that. Let's see. And count star greater than 35,000. Let's try that. Aggregate functions not allowed in where. That's right. We learned that we can't do any type of aggregation from the where clause. This is where having comes into play. So let's remove this. And the way to do some filtering in an aggregation is to add it after the group by and order by, having count star greater than 35,000. Let's try it now. Oh, syntax error. So what this means is, and you'll encounter this quite often, and I forgot about this, it must mean that the ordering of the clauses is incorrect. And this is just something that you'll go ahead and have to practice. So let's try and see where SQL wants us to put it. I think it's here. So group by 1, then I'm filtering this, and only after I'm done filtering does it make sense to start sorting, right? Because you can't sort, well, you could, but SQL wants you to filter first and then sort. So let's go ahead and try that. Boom, and we get a result. All right, and finally, the other thing that we learned is just using the as here, and we can call this number of transactions. So just adding as, it allows us to name the column of our result. Number of transactions. All right, so I hope this example was useful for you, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out on Slack. Thanks.